Mark 1. Conversations at the speed of sound. Hello and welcome to this episode of Mach 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. My name is Gary Hills and I'll be your host. Thank you for listening to this, which will be the first of 3 special episodes dedicated to the Lockheed P-3 Orion, one of which we have on display, an P-3C Orion A9760. And if you're interested, after listening to this conversation, to glean more information about its provenance and its history, go to the Queensland Air Museum website and click on Collections, and you can scroll through all of the aircraft here on display and read every detail about the provenance of each one of them, assembled and maintained by the QAM historian Ron Cuskelly. Have a look for the P-3 Orion and you'll be able to read about the history and the provenance of 760 right up until when it was trucked to Caloundra from the Sunshine Coast Airport, where it had landed after its final flight from Edinburgh, South Australia, and been dismantled and brought across and then reassembled for display. We'll talk about that process in a couple of weeks' time. I was fortunate enough to interview a gentleman who kept a photographic and diary record of that some 9 to 12 month process whereby the Orion was disassembled, transported and reassembled. That's in a couple of weeks' time, but next week you're going to hear from a couple of the air crew and ground crew who worked on the P-3Cs. One of them was a flight engineer, the other was an airframe fitter. You'll hear my conversation with both of those gentlemen. Both of them are volunteers at the QAM. But for today, you're going to hear from a pilot who flew the P-3 Orions, a QAM volunteer and guide by the name of Maurice Ritchie. Some of you who are podcast listeners to Mach 1 will remember Maurice earlier in Season 1 talking about his career flying the Lockheed Neptune and his recollections about transferring across from the Neptune to the Orion are very memorable. Let's listen to my conversation recently in the QAM studio with QAM volunteer and guide and former pilot Maurice Ritchie. Maurice, you've spoken to us before on the podcast and we really appreciate you coming back. Would you tell us where you're from and what is your background in aviation?
All right, Gary. I'm originally from a little town outside Ballarat, a place called Dean. It used to be a one-horse town, and I learnt to fly at the Ballarat Aero Club on an Air Force scholarship because I was in the Air Training Corps, and then moved from there, joined the Air Force later on when I was 20, flew after graduation, flew Neptunes and P-3 Orions. And then when I separated from the Air Force, I joined Trans-Australia Airlines. Right,
TAA. Okay, thank you. And we're focusing in today on the P-3s, the Orions, and we're very proud to have A9760 here at the Queensland Air Museum. And everybody is amazed at the size and scope of this huge aircraft. So you're a pilot, you flew Orions between 1978 and 81, I think.
That's correct, okay. After the Neptunes, Gary.
After the Neptunes. Now, tell us about the Orion. What was its role? What was it designed to do? And particularly with the RAAF?
Right. Well, Gary, it was a modified airliner, which used to be the Lockheed Electra. Mm. And they shortened the fuselage, put more powerful engines in it, a bomb bay, and provision for sonobuoys. And the Royal Australian Air Force used it for multiple things. It's designed for anti-submarine warfare initially. That was its primary task. We used it for targeting ships for attacks by the F-111s, search and rescue, coastal surveillance, customs observations, some VIP transport for senior officers, and that's about it when I was flying up.
Okay. And you would have been involved in missions and exercises that involved all of those at one time or another, I imagine. So 4 engines, 4 Allison turboprops. Describe a typical search and rescue mission. What would be involved for you guys? How many crew? What sort of hours are you in the air? What sort of things would you do?
Well, Gary, typically the crew would be 12 in those days. We didn't have a surplus of air crew. And we would be tasked for search and rescue either East Coast or West Coast generally, some close inshore, some further out to sea. One that I particularly remember was because we were tasked into a cyclone up Lady Elliot Island for a schooner called the Thisbe. We never saw it. We were overhead time after time. They couldn't see us because of the weather. We couldn't see them. We couldn't get very low because we didn't know how high the masts were, if they'd dismantled them or whatever. Eventually, even the helicopters that were coming out to search for them, they couldn't continue flying. So it was the worst weather possible. That was the most noticeable search and rescue, the most memorable search and rescue I've had.
And you were never able to find the yacht?
Well, the yacht eventually ran aground on Lady Elliot Island, so all was saved. So counting them, I can count 64 people I've saved at sea. Yeah.
Is that right? That's
between
fantastic.
the Neptunes and the P-3s.
Wow. And so a search and rescue of that kind, it's all visual?
Well, there's also homing from radar and radio, because usually if the ship or boat was reasonably equipped, they'd have an emergency locator beacon. So we were tasked out, on that case, we were tasked out of Amberley for the whole 2 days trying to find it, which we found it, as I said, from radar, and but never able to get a visual sighting of it at all.
And how long would the Orion stay in the air?
Well, my longest flight has been 15 hours. That was a custom surveillance flight out of Townsville. Our relief aircraft broke down, so we were out there for 15 hours until our next relief aircraft came back. We landed with our reserves intact, so there's no
So
drama.
15 hours is not excessive. It could do 15 hours.
Oh, yes. I'm sure it could do more if you really tried hard. I did a pilot continuation sortie of 14 hours one time. Left Edinburgh. They said go and do some training. So we ended up stopping at every air base along the way from Edinburgh, Avalon, East Sail. Then we decided we'd go up to Whanuapai in Auckland and did an approach over there without touching down because we didn't have diplomatic air clearance. Then we turned south, went down to the South Island, came back west to Hobart, then up the coast, up the valley rather, to Launceston, and then back to Edinburgh, and landed with the reserves intact after 14 hours.
Wow.
I was the only one who was happy about that. The rest of the crew was pretty sick of it by then.
Now, I think also the P3s are unique in the sense that they had you had a flight engineer on board. We don't do that really anymore, do we?
No.
With aircraft. So describe the role of the flight engineer when you're the captain. How did that work?
Well, the flight engineer, we had always had 2 pilots and 2 flight engineers. So the flight engineers had a good union because they could rotate every hour, whereas the pilots had to sit there pretty much all the time. And in those days, the toilet, the lavatory, was close to the cockpit. When they modified them to AP3Cs, they put the toilet right down the back. So I don't think that was a good idea. But anyway.
It's a long way to walk.
Yes, it is. So the flight engineer was our backup. Because he sat in the middle seat and it was a little higher elevation, he actually had a better view if we were looking for visual contacts. And he was the Orion was based on the Electra, as I've said. And in the day, it was a modern concept of forward-facing cockpit. So from the 3 crew members there, all they had to do was look up or forward, and all their instruments and panels were in front of them. They didn't have to look over their shoulders to find anything. So it was advanced for its day in the Electra 59, 60. So he looked after the fuel panels, fuel transfer, was the backup for engine failures or the regular shutting down of the number 1 engine or occasionally number 4 engine as well. So.
Now, describe the regular shutting down of the number 1 engine.
Oh, right. Well, we'd transit out on 4 engines to an area. Say we're doing an exercise against a submarine or something. We'd transit out on 4 engines as fast as we could. And then when we went down low level, we could shut down number 1 engine because it didn't have a generator on it, and that would save fuel. So we could increase our time on task. When we got down to a certain weight, which I can't remember now, we could shut down the number 4 engine as well, again to save more fuel, except there was a restriction about going below 1,500 feet on 2 engines.
Okay, so it was possible to have the 2 inboard engines powering the flight and the other 2.
Yes.
And I think the way we have our Orion set up on display, number 1 engine propellers is feathered.
Feathered, as would normally be
Correct.
on a loitering mission, yes.
Yeah, to show what that looks like. And so explain to us what feathering a prop is all about.
Well, the engine would be shut down, but the propeller would, if it wasn't feathered, it would keep rotating in the F stream, causing drag. So the propellers are feathered by turning the blades parallel to the airflow, so minimum drag.
Yep.
And they wouldn't rotate, they'd just sit there.
Okay. And describe what the P-3 was able to do when it was hunting for submarines. What was the process there of looking for a submerged vessel?
Well, in that case, what we were using mostly are sonar buoys. So there are 2 types. There's passive or active. And the active ones are what you see in the submarine movies where you hear a ping and a replying ping, whereas the others would be just listening to noises. And they were very effective, especially our Barra Australian-developed sonar buoys, the SSQ 801, I think that was. And we could, as pilots, listen in on the channel and hear what was going on. And you could hear ships, submarines, whales, shrimp even.
Wow.
Very effective. And each ship and submarine has its own sound signature. So that you could tell if that was such and such a ship or yeah.
Yeah, you could identify the vessel.
Them by the sound, yes.
Yeah.
So that usually a submarine wants to stay below the surface. Occasionally they'll come up to snorkel, which means they're running on the diesels with the air coming in at about periscope depth, especially conventional submarines, non-nuclear.
Yeah.
So the radar could be effective at spotting that. And it's a small target. A periscope and snorkel's only 2 pipes sticking above the water, a couple of metres.
What about the magnetic anomaly detector? Was that used as much as the sonar buoys?
Well, the magnetic anomaly detector was the final stages of the attack. Once you've got a fix, the TACO, the technical coordinator, would home the aircraft to the predicted position of the submarine. And then the magnetic anomaly detector would be the final quiet way to get a final fix before you dropped a torpedo or usually a torpedo.
So it's measuring the magnetic field of the Earth.
Yes.
And it's able to detect an aberration if there's a steel hull.
That's correct. Or even other...
Or anything.
Yes.
Even a whale.
Change. Yes, I think that'd be a little harder.
Okay. Yeah.
I did 10 flights on a special project. We were looking for an underwater ridge south of Australia, around about 55 degrees south. So NOAA, the American agency, modified one of our P3s with a very sensitive, extra sensitive magnetic anomaly detector, basically double the range of our usual one. So we would go down to 1,000 feet, head south across the Great Southern Ocean, looking for the readout of what was coming up. And we did find the ridge. It's called Investigator Ridge.
Wow.
And but the weather down there was just incredibly bad. It was, we'd be on a radar altimeter and we'd be still moving up perhaps 100 feet, down 100 feet, just following the waves. So, yes, a useful thing, but it's interesting with the new P8s that the only operators who use that are the Indian Navy. The rest of the operators decided it wasn't a value anymore.
So the sonar boys are the first line of
Yes.
searching. So explain. So all right. I think we are roughly familiar with the notion of the ping.
Yes.
Ping. It sends out a sound wave through the water, and the returning echo from a vessel is what you're listening for.
That's
isn't it?
correct.
Whereas with the passive sonar buoys, you're listening for engine noises.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
And I think I saw you showed me a photograph before of your parents' house.
Yes.
Are we allowed to talk about that?
Why not?
You flew low over your parents' property. Was that right?
That's correct. We were tasked to look for a possible missing crop duster near Ballarat. And since it was very close to my parents' property, I decided on the way from there, we didn't find the crop duster. As we're heading towards Melbourne, I decided we'd go via my parents' farm. So 500 feet, quite safe. 2 runs, one to get my mother's attention and my father's attention, and then one more pass, and then off we went. And so my father was working under the header at the first pass, and he just sat up on a sudden and banged his head. And I came back the next time. I could see my mother waving her apron and the dogs running around. So when my father got to the happy hour on Friday night, all these local mates said, "Geez, Don, that's the biggest crop duster I've ever seen." So,
and it is big, isn't it? I mean, at 500 feet,
yes.
It must have been quite a sight.
Oh, it would have been, yes. We weren't going very fast. We're just sliding in across the ridge down to the valley, yes.
So was it describe it as an aircraft to fly? What was it like? How would you describe it?
It was beautiful. Compared to the Neptune, and Neptune was like an old farm truck, and the P-3 was like a brand new 4-cab that could do highway speeds. It was air conditioned, it was clean, roomy, and I remember mostly being fast. Its limiting speed was 10 knots, 10 nautical miles per hour, faster than the 747-400.
Wow.
They were effectively 750 kilometres per hour.
And when it was as the Electra, it didn't have those same engines, did it?
No.
So,
the engines on the P-3 are about 1,000 horsepower in old money, more powerful.
And for anybody who visits and looks inside, has a bit of a wander around, it is massive inside. You can get the sense that this was a commercial airliner hull originally. There are specialist stations throughout the technical stations throughout the fuselage, and right down the back the galley.
Yes, and rest
sleeping
area.
Quarters there. Yes, and an actual toilet is quite an advance.
Yes. Well, we didn't need to put a lock on the door in those days because there were no female crew.
Of course,
all male crew. So it was knock on the door and enter if necessary.
So we're speaking in 2022. Are there any P3s still operating in Australia?
Not in well, actually, yes, there are 2 still operating in Australia, Gary. There are 2 electronic spy planes, for want of a better word, operating with 10 Squadron at Edinburgh, outside of Adelaide. There are still a lot of P3s operating around the world in various countries. New Zealand still has 4. That'd be the closest to us. The Japanese, the Taiwanese have them.
Okay.
So,
and they've been replaced with the P8 in Australia for the RAAF. That's the Poseidon.
That's correct.
Okay. And have you had a chance to get up close and personal with a Poseidon?
I have, actually, yes. I was a little disappointed, to be honest.
Really?
Yes, because it doesn't have really the amenities the P3 has. Like, its galley is non-existent, very minuscule anyway.
Really?
They don't have bunks like we had, so it's not... And of course, 2 pilots, there's no flight engineers to relieve.
No.
So in some ways I thought wasn't quite as good as what we had.
You were in the glory days,
yes,
I guess.
I think so. Going to the States to do the pickup was great, really good.
So describe that. You went to the US.
Oh, yes. Now, there's one thing that sticks out in my mind. We got the P3s out there. They're P-3C 2.5. So the US Navy squadron that was training us at Moffett Field, south of San Francisco, they only got the training manuals a week before our first crews arrived.
Okay.
So they were on a steeper learning curve than we were, because the US Navy didn't have that particular submodel yet.
Right.
But they were excellent training people. And I remember one time with a US Navy lieutenant commander. He came from the Deep South, Alabama, Arkansas, somewhere. And the US Navy air traffic controllers are all enlisted men, NCOs.
Right.
And they would fire off these complicated clearances to us, really fast, static.
With a broad accent.
Yeah, well, we could understand the accent well enough, but it was just so fast that it was hard to comprehend easily. So one day I was flying with Lieutenant Commander Brunson, and he said, "Hey, Tower, you all know who this is, don't you?" "Yes, sir, Commander, we sure do." He said, "I'm training these Aussies, don't you know?" And they said, "Yes, sir, Commander, we sure do." And he said, "Well, I've discovered these Aussies can only listen about as fast as I can talk. So we'd appreciate those clearances going a little bit slower in future." And they did. Problem solved. And then one of my other training, he's a lieutenant, a US Navy lieutenant. We're on a shakedown flight, which basically went from San Francisco to Seattle, halfway to Chicago and down towards the south. And we got talking about the Grand Canyon, and he said, "Have you seen the Grand Canyon?" I said, "Well, I've seen pictures of it." And he said, "No, but I mean, really seen it?" I said, "Well, no." So he said, "Okay, well," called up area ATC and said, "We're going OCTA, outside of control zone area." We dropped down into the canyon itself at its widest point.
Wow.
And, of course, I wasn't carrying a camera at the time, but we're below the level of the canyon, where it's about 5 miles across. Wow. And for a few minutes, and then we came up and then went back to Moffett Field. Amazing.
You got to have some fun, didn't you?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So then, after 1981, what happened then for you?
Oh, 81, I left the Air Force. I was I'd been posted to 292 Training Squadron. I was in charge of the brief debrief area, where we put the information on the computer tapes. We used tape reel-to-reel computers in those days. Anyway, I was lucky enough to join Trans-Australia Airlines after that, and from there went on to other flying in the Solomon Islands, flying for Solomon Airlines. Then I went up to Taiwan to fly for Eva Air, their private airline up there, flying 747s, MD-11s and 777s, retired on them.
Okay, as captain.
As captain, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a toe in the water, Maurice. Thank you very much for talking, because there's so much there I would like to talk about, particularly your post-Air Force flying career too, and the experiences you had there, and we'll come back to do that. But in the meantime, it's been great, because we wanted to talk about the P3 and introduce the Orion to our listeners, and you've done that very well for us, so thank you very much.
You're more than welcome, Gary.
So that's our episode. Thanks for listening to the first of our 3 episodes dedicated to the Lockheed P3 Orion, the P-3C. Next week you'll hear slightly different perspectives on the P3 from a flight engineer and a member of ground crew. And then following that, you'll hear about the epic deconstruction, transport and reconstruction phase, which has brought the display to where it is today. That's next week. Please join us then. It's been great to have your company in this episode. Don't forget, we're open from 10 a.m. till 4 p.m. every day, except Christmas Day and Easter Friday. And we're at 7 Pathfinder Drive, Caloundra, right across the road from the Caloundra Airport. Come in and see us soon. We'd love to meet you. Bye for now.